In forgotten corners of Asia, where the river mists never lift, where incense coils burn long after the dead are gone, where lullabies are whispered not to soothe, but to warn. This is Whispers of Asia, where ancient spirits never rest and rituals long buried find their voice again. Tonight, we return to the Mekong Delta, to a village swallowed by silence where grief is not healed but fed, where a cradle weaves together the living and the dead, one red string at a time. They say if you place an offering beneath the ghost moon and call your lost child by name, the cradle will answer. But not everything that cries in the dark is meant to be held. This is the Whispering Cradle of Bến Troi, a tale of grief, ritual, and a spirit that does not seek love, only a womb to return through. Listen closely. The cradle is rocking. The rain was soft the day Lan returned to Bến Troi, the kind of drizzle that hung in the air like memory. The river smelled like wet earth and something older, something forgotten. Banana trees leaned heavy over the narrow dirt road, their broad leaves collecting raindrops like offerings in a monk's bowl. And in the stillness of the morning, the village awaited her, as if it had been holding its breath for years. Lan's hands trembled on the steering wheel as the car rolled to a stop in front of her grandmother's house, a weathered wooden structure with green shutters, now sun-bleached and chipped. She hadn't been back since she was 12, not since the funeral, not since the whispers. The house stood alone now, surrounded by swaying palms and slow-moving fog, its stilts rising from the mud like the legs of a sleeping beast. Time had not been kind. The paint had peeled, the bamboo fencing had collapsed in places, and yet the house still watched, silent, intact, as if waiting for her return. She stepped out, her black heels sinking into the wet soil. In her arms, she carried a suitcase, a wrapped bundle of incense sticks, and her grief. It had been 3 months since the miscarriage. The doctors told her it was common, that it was nobody's fault, that she could try again. But no one tells you how loud the silence becomes when a child is lost before it ever breathes. Lan didn't come to Bến Troi for healing. She came because something inside her refused to let go. The villagers watched her from doorways and under conical hats, offering half smiles, murmurs, quick glances. It wasn't hostility, not exactly, more like recognition, as if they saw not just her, but something behind her, or perhaps something missing. "Chi Lan, Phys Roy ha?" An old woman called from across the dirt path. Aunt Ba, her grandmother's neighbor. Skin folded like old papyrus, eyes clouded with time. Lan nodded politely, forcing a smile. "I'm just staying for a while, to clean up the house." Aunt Ba said nothing for a moment, then added quietly, "It still remembers her, you know, Gutu. She never left, not fully." Lan didn't respond. She didn't believe in ghosts. Or rather, she didn't want to believe. Not after the things she'd heard as a child. Not after the things she'd seen in dreams that felt too real. Inside, the house smelled mothballs and smoke, incense, old jasmine tea, the scent of her grandmother. Dust danced in the filtered light, and faded portraits lined the altar wall, ancestors with glassy stares, too solemn to welcome her. Lan walked through the room slowly, trailing her fingers along the walls as if reacquainting herself with a memory. Everything was as she remembered, and not. The altar table was still set, bowls of dried rice, petrified offerings, red candles melted into twisted sculptures. Her grandmother's sandals still sat by the door, and in the corner of the prayer room, the family mirror covered with a yellow cloth. Lon hesitated, then pulled it off. Her reflection stared back, pale, thinner than she remembered, eyes rimmed with fatigue. But the strangest thing was how the mirror made her feel watched, as if someone else stood behind the glass, just a step behind her. She covered it again. That night, the rain returned heavier. Lon boiled water on the old clay stove and sat alone in the kitchen, listening to the ticking of the wall clock and the frogs croaking somewhere outside. The silence in the house was a weight. It pressed against her temples. It curled around her shoulders like an old shawl. Then a creak, the kind that a cradle might make. Lon froze, listened. It came again, rhythmic, soft, creak, creak. She told herself it was the wind or a rat or the old wood settling. But the sound had a strange intention, not random, almost maternal, as if some tired hand was gently rocking something back and forth in the dark. She stood, walked toward the prayer room. The sound stopped. Lon turned on the light. Nothing. But her eyes were drawn to the altar, to the space beneath it, a space she had never thought to check before. She knelt, pulled aside a loose sheet of wood. There, hidden in the shadows beneath the family altar, lay a small cradle, woven from pale bamboo and bound at the joints with red string. Though the rest of the room was dry, the cradle was damp, not wet from the rain, but as if something had just been placed in it. Lon's breath caught. She didn't know why, but she reached out and touched it. The moment her fingers met the wood, a whisper brushed her ear. Not in a language she understood, not even a word, just breath, just presence. Later that night, Lon stood by the window, staring out at the slow sweep of the river. Fireflies blinked near the banana trees. The village was quiet, peaceful. But behind her, in the house, something had shifted. She could feel it. Her reflection in the glass lingered a second longer than she did as she turned away. It smiled faintly, even though her own face did not. And somewhere deep in the shadows, the cradle rocked again.
The next morning arrived veiled in mist. Lan stepped outside, barefoot, into dew-damp grass. The village was quiet, as always, but there was something brittle in the air, as if the silence could snap if she breathed too hard. In the distance, a rooster crowed 3 times, but the sound felt strangely muted, swallowed by the fog like a secret. She hadn't slept. Every time her eyes closed, she saw it again. The cradle beneath the altar, slick with dampness, wrapped in time-worn red string. And in her dream, it wasn't empty. Something moved inside it, small, breathing, almost humming. A lullaby with no words. Lan shook herself back to the present and ducked under the rusted corrugated roof of the well behind the house. Her grandmother's old bucket still hung there, frayed rope knotted over and over again. She pulled it up with effort and washed her face in cold water. But as she leaned over the basin, she caught sight of her reflection in the metal, and her stomach turned. Her eyes blinked too slowly. Her mouth twitched upward. It wasn't just a trick of the light. something behind her face was smiling. She dropped the bucket with a clang and stumbled backward, breath caught in her throat. Inside, she made tea the way her grandmother used to. Lotus petals, dried ginger, a whisper of rock sugar. She sat on the floor beside the altar and stared at the space where the cradle lay, still tucked beneath the wooden frame, partially veiled in shadow. This time, she pulled it out completely. It was small, like a bassinet, carefully woven but worn in places, strands of bamboo frayed like veins. The red string had faded to brown in some sections, and tucked into the edges were faint flecks of white dust. She brought it to her nose. Ash, sweet and bitter, lotus ash. She remembered the stories. When a child dies before being born, the old women said, its spirit lingers, confused, trapped between breath and silence. And unless it is called back or sent away properly, it will cling to its mother's shadow forever. They used to whisper about things like this after funerals, about women who dreamt of tiny hands around their necks, about shadows that giggled, about lullabies sung in houses with no children. Her grandmother had been one of those women. 7 miscarriages, only one living daughter, Lan's mother, who left as soon as she could. Lan touched the cradle again. It wasn't just an heirloom. It was a ritual object, a vut goi hon, a soul-calling vessel. Her grandmother must have used it, not just once, but why had it been hidden? A soft knock at the front gate interrupted her thoughts. It was Aunt Ba again, holding a basket of mangosteens and herbs. "You're alone?" Aunt Ba asked as she stepped inside without waiting. "You shouldn't stay alone in that house." Lan smiled politely. "I'll be fine." Aunt Ba glanced toward the altar room, her lips pressed tight. "You found it, didn't you?" Lan's smile faded. "The cradle." A pause. Then, "Yes." Aunt Ba sighed and lowered herself onto a stool. "I told her to burn it after the last one, but she wouldn't. Said it still worked. Said it still answered." "Answered what?" Lan asked. "The child." Lan blinked. "But there was no child." "There never is," Aunt Ba whispered. "Not really." That evening, as the sky bruised to purple and the river glowed red with dusk, Lan lit a single stick of incense at the altar. She didn't know what to pray for, so she simply said her child's name, just once, softly. The house seemed to hold its breath. Then, something in the cradle shifted, not loudly, not physically, but perceptibly, as if the very air around it rearranged itself, like a blanket had just been pulled tighter around an invisible shape. Lan leaned closer, her breath shallow. And then she heard it, the faintest sound, not crying, but the beginning of crying, like the inhale before a sob, a wet noise, like lips parting. Then silence. Lan staggered back. She wanted to run. She wanted to leave the house, the village, the entire country if she had to, but she couldn't. Something had just happened, something impossible and yet undeniable. That sound, that breath, it was hers, her child's. She was sure of it. And suddenly she couldn't stop shaking, not from fear, but from hope. That night, she sat beside the cradle on the woven mat. Candlelight flickered against the wooden walls. Outside, crickets sang. Inside, the shadows waited. Lan leaned forward and whispered again, the name. This time, the sound came faster, a gurgle, a soft rasp, like an infant exhaling after sleep. The cradle didn't move, but the red string on one corner had tightened slightly, pulling taut. It looked fresh. Suddenly, the candle beside her extinguished, not from a breeze, but from inside, as if something sucked the flame inward. Darkness bloomed. Lon reached for her phone, fumbling, hands slick with sweat. The screen lit up, and in the reflection of the cradle's bamboo surface, she saw it. A face, small, pale, smiling. But it wasn't her child. She didn't know what it was. She didn't sleep. She sat in the kitchen with all the lights on, boiling pot after pot of tea she never drank. By morning, the cradle had shifted 2 inches to the left. Lan hadn't touched it. And in the rice offering bowl on the altar, something had been added. One tiny, blackened milk tooth. The walls began to hum on the 3rd night. At first, Lon thought it was the rain, the soft percussion of droplets tapping the wooden shutters. But when she pressed her ear to the wall just beside the prayer room, she realized it wasn't water. It was music. A lullaby. No lyrics, just a haunting melody, hummed low and slow, like a mother cradling something too delicate to touch. The sound seeped from the wooden beams, not through them, but within them, as if the house itself was remembering. Lon stood frozen in the hallway, heart caught in her throat. The melody was beautiful in the most terrible way, familiar, ancient, like a song she had heard in the womb but could never name. And then the humming stopped. Silence crashed into the house like a wave. Then, tap. Just one, a sharp, deliberate knock from inside the wall, right beside her ear. She recoiled. Silence again. But the cold in the room had changed. It wasn't just the weather. It was an absence, a spiritual hollowness, as if something had moved through the house and left a vacuum behind. Lon did not sleep that night. In the morning, she found footprints. Tiny ones, bare, muddy, and no bigger than a doll's. They started at the edge of the cradle and led across the altar room to the covered mirror. The footprints stopped at the cloth, then vanished. Lon slowly peeled the cloth away. Her reflection stared back, still her, still pale, still grieving. But something about her eyes felt wrong. Too alert, too still, as if the reflection had been watching her all night and had only just frozen into place. She reached out and touched the glass. Her reflection smiled. She didn't. That afternoon, she called her mother in Hanoi. "Did Grandma ever talk to you about the miscarriages?" Lon asked, her voice cautious. There was a long silence on the line. "She said the house was cursed. She used to do these little ceremonies, alone. Told me not to ask. Told me I was her only lucky one." "Did she ever mention a cradle?" Her mother went quiet again. Then, "You found it, didn't you?" Lon closed her eyes. "Yes." Another pause. "Don't use it," she whispered. "Please. I left that place for a reason." Lon wanted to ask more, but her mother ended the call without saying goodbye. That night, the lullaby returned. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the cradle. Lon stood in the hallway, barely breathing. The air was thick, as if soaked in resin. The lights flickered once, then dimmed to a soft candle-like glow,
though no flame burned in the room. The cradle moved, gently, rocking. Lan took a slow step forward, her bare feet silent on the wood. The sound grew clearer, a noise now, a voice, a woman's voice, low, melancholy, as though mourning what she was trying to soothe. And then the voice changed. It deepened, warbled, cracked, like something mimicking a lullaby without understanding what it meant. Lan stepped into the room, and the cradle stopped. Everything stopped. The silence was absolute. Then a child's giggle, not joyful, but mocking, wet and broken. Lan's knees gave way. She crawled backward out of the room, breath ragged, and behind her, the reflection in the glass cabinet didn't follow. It stood still, watching, smiling. She woke the next morning on the floor of the kitchen, clutching a bowl of uncooked rice like a talisman. Sunlight streamed through the cracks in the walls, gentle and golden. The house looked peaceful again. But on the altar, the offerings had changed. The fruit had rotted overnight. The rice was filled with worms, and where there once was incense, there now stood a single burnt-out candle, shaped like a child's foot. She went into the village that day, barefoot and pale. She found Aunt Ba squatting by the river, washing herbs in silence. "Tell me everything," Lan said. The old woman looked up. Her eyes held no surprise, only sorrow. "Your grandmother couldn't let them go," she said. "Each time she lost a child, she made an offering, a lock of hair, a drop of milk, lotus ash and red thread, and she waited." "For what?" she asked. "For the cradle to answer." Lan swallowed hard. "Did it?" Aunt Ba nodded slowly. "But not always the way she wanted. Sometimes the wrong soul came back. Sometimes nothing came back at all." "And the lullaby?" "She used to hum it every night, even after she was alone. Said it helped her remember who she'd lost, or maybe who she hadn't." That evening, Lan returned to the house with salt, garlic, and holy water. She poured a protective line across the thresholds, lit pure white candles, played recordings of Buddhist chants on her phone. She told herself it would keep the spirit away. But deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't outside trying to get in. It was already inside. That night, as she lay curled on the mat pretending to sleep, the lullaby began again, this time from right behind her head. Lan rolled over slowly. No one was there, but the candle beside the cradle had been relit, and the mirror was uncovered. In its reflection, the cradle was not empty.
It was the old monk by the river who told her about the red moon. She found him sitting on a flat stone, scattering crumbs for the fish that never came. He was blind, or nearly. One eye milk white, the other flickering like a flame in wind. He didn't ask who she was, didn't need to. "You hear it humming yet?" he asked without turning. "It's louder when the cradle is hungry." Lan sat beside him, slow and cautious. "I didn't feed it," she said. "But you called it," he replied, "and now it waits. The red moon rises soon. The gate will open wider than usual." Lan stared at him. "What gate?" The monk dipped his fingers into the water, then wiped them on his sleeve. "The gate between grief and guilt, the one your grandmother opened, the one she never closed. She wanted to argue, but there was no point. He already knew. Somehow everyone in this village knew. "Can it bring my child back?" she asked. A long silence. Then the monk turned his head slightly toward her. "Only if your child still remembers the way. Only if something worse doesn't answer first." That night, the moon bled. It rose from the horizon like a wound in the sky, deep crimson, veiled in mist, larger than it had ever appeared in her lifetime. The villagers stayed inside. No incense burned at any altar. No lights flickered in windows. Even the animals were silent. But in Lan's house, the cradle waited. It had been scrubbed clean with lotus water and rock salt. Red string re-wrapped its joints. A fresh silk cloth lined the base, and beside it, a small bowl of rice, crushed amber, and the ashes of a letter she had written to the child she lost. She stood before the altar, candlelight trembling against her face. Then slowly, she stepped forward and placed the offering into the cradle. The room shifted, not physically, spiritually, as if the house had inhaled, as if the air had tightened. And then came the sound. First, the soft creak of the cradle, then the lullaby, no longer distant or ghostly, but close, sung by a voice that knew her name. Lan felt her knees give way. She sank to the floor, overcome. And then the crying began, real, wet, agonized, a newborn's wail ripping through the silence like a blade. Lan covered her mouth, tears already running down her cheeks. It was him. She knew it. She knew it. Her body remembered that sound, the way her womb had ached when it ended, the way the hospital room had fallen quiet, the way no one dared to look her in the eye. She crawled toward the cradle. "Conoi, Mede," she whispered. The crying stopped. Lan reached out with trembling fingers, and the voice answered. Not the infant, something older, mocking, a wet giggle laced with teeth. Lan screamed and scrambled back. The cradle rocked violently, red string snapping, wood groaning. From the shadows around it, something began to take shape, not fully visible, not flesh, but suggested, like smoke trapped in a human mold. The room grew colder, the air sharpened, her breath turned visible. Then, silent. The cradle stopped moving. Whatever had begun to form dissolved, but the scent lingered. Rotten milk, burned silk, and beneath it all, blood. At dawn, Lan found claw marks on the altar wood, deep, blackened grooves not made by any human hand. In the rice offering bowl, the grains had turned to teeth, tiny, cracked baby teeth, still bleeding. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She cleaned it all up. And that night, she placed another offering. She told herself it was desperation, that grief made people do strange things. But deep down, she knew the truth. Something had answered. Not her child, but something close enough to fool her. And now, she couldn't stop. Days passed, nights blurred. Lan's world shrank to a single room, a single ritual. Offer, listen, whisper, wait. The lullaby grew louder each evening, the voice more articulate, the cradle more active. And in her dreams, she walked fields of red string, waist-deep in ash, while infants with hollow faces crawled behind her begging to be held. She woke one morning with ash in her mouth, another with her belly bloated as if in the second trimester. But by afternoon, it always faded, The illusion never stayed. Still, she kept offering. Still, she kept hoping. On the 7th night of the red moon cycle, the lullaby changed. It was no longer a song. It was a chant, low, ritualistic, spoken in a dialect she did not understand, yet felt in her bones. She stood before the cradle, hands dripping with sweat, incense smoldering at her feet. The voice spoke through the walls now, through her mirror. Her own reflection mouthed the words, her eyes hollow, her smile motherly. And when Lan whispered her child's name this time, the reflection answered with her own. Not Khan, not child, but Lan. Later that night, she sat by the cradle with a candle and asked it directly, "What do you want?" The candle flickered violently. The cradle shifted. A gust of cold air swept through the room, and a single word echoed in the air, soft, ancient, terrifying. Womb. Lan stopped saying the name on the 8th night. Not because she no longer believed it was her child, but because she began to suspect it wasn't. What returned was clever, too clever. It no longer cried in gasps and wails like a newborn. It cooed, mimicked, laughed at the wrong moments. It waited until she was alone, until she whispered apologies or prayers, and then it answered with sounds just close enough to her child's voice, but laced with something else, something playful, something cruel. At first, she had wept with joy when it called her May. Now the way it said it made her skin crawl, like it was savoring the word, like it was learning her. The cradle rocked at odd hours, even when the house was still. It never moved while she watched, only when her back was turned. But she began to notice things left behind after the rocking stopped. Signs that something had occupied the cradle. A wet imprint, a faint indentation like curled fingers, and once a slick trail of blackened milk that led all the way from the cradle to the base of the altar mirror. Lan followed it with shaking hands, but when she wiped the glass clean, her reflection didn't return right away. Only a delay of a second, maybe 2, but enough. She returned to Aunt Ba, desperate. The old woman met her outside the fence and refused to go near the house. "I offered under the red moon," she confessed. "I asked him for back. I gave everything, and something came." Aunt Ba looked at her with pity, not surprise. "What did you give?" "A name, hair, milk, ashes from the hospital letter." The old woman turned her face away. "You gave it an anchor. Now it won't leave." "But it's not him," Lan whispered. "No, it never is." Lan felt a cold bloom in her stomach. "What is it?" "The one your grandmother let in by mistake. She tried to banish it, but it learned. It remembered, and now it wears faces, especially ones we love." Lan stopped sleeping entirely, not out of fear, but because the house only whispered when she was awake. The moment her eyes closed, the thing in the cradle moved louder, with confidence. It tested its limbs, it practiced its voice. It called her May again, but this time with sarcasm, mocking, like it knew the role, but didn't believe in it. She found her grandmother's diary sealed inside the back of the altar, bound in rice paper and soaked with dried tears. The entries were fragmented, desperate, increasingly unstable. "I heard his voice again last night, but it wasn't him. It was smiling too much." The third offering failed. The milk curdled before I placed it. The spirit took it anyway. The cradle is not a bridge anymore. It's a door, and it only swings one way now. Lan flipped to the final pages and found a prayer, scrawled in a mix of Vietnamese and Pali, smudged with what looked like blood. It was a banishment ritual, designed not to cast the spirit out, but to remind it of its unfinished death. The catch: it required a living womb to anchor the rite. Lan stared at the words for a long time. Then, for the first time in weeks, she truly wept. That night, the cradle spoke to her. Not with cries, but with words. Short, broken, breathless, but unmistakably human. Feed me. Lan stood in the doorway, frozen. The cradle sat still in the corner, red string now frayed and fluttering as if something inside had begun tearing from within. Her reflection in the glass behind it tilted its head and whispered again, "Mommy, I'm cold." Lan stepped forward, instinct warring with terror. But before she could speak, the reflection's mouth widened too far, splitting across the cheek like torn paper, and it screamed, voice shrill with rage, "You called me!" Lan stumbled backward, hitting the altar. Incense scattered, the cradle shook violently. And then, stillness. The mirror cracked. One line, straight down the center. And her reflection smiled. She began bleeding the next morning. Not heavily, just a drop, but enough to feel like something had started. She wasn't pregnant. She couldn't be, not medically, after the surgery. But her womb ached with a phantom weight, the same tugging pressure she remembered from the second trimester. She vomited bile, her hands trembled, and when she looked into the mirror again, her skin looked younger, fuller, as if something was nourishing her from the inside out, or perhaps preparing her. Lan no longer left the house. She lit incense on the hour. She chanted her grandmother's prayer over and over. She began speaking to the spirit directly. Sometimes it answered. Sometimes it mocked her with silence. And sometimes it cried again, just like before. Those were the worst moments, because part of her still wanted to believe, still hoped, still ached for her child's return, even if it was just a whisper of who he might have been. But in the pit of her soul, Lan finally understood. She hadn't brought her baby back. She had fed her grief to something ancient, something hollow, something that needed her womb not to live, but to cross. And the cradle had chosen her, just as it once chose her grandmother. The old diary pages were brittle. Lan sat cross-legged beneath the altar, candlelight trembling around her. Her fingers moved slowly, reverently, as she turned each fragile sheet. Ink faded, some words smudged as though wept upon. Her grandmother's handwriting was once precise, but as the pages went on, it grew ragged, frantic, like someone trying to trap a spirit inside paper before it slipped free. He came to me in the voice of the firstborn. I made the offerings wrong. The moonin was full, but not red. The milk was warm, not curdled. I used my daughter's name. I should have used mine. The child returned,
but only in face. The eyes were not right. I bathed it in lotus ash. I whispered lullabies. I told myself it was him, but it learned too fast. It watched too long. It began to ask things. Lan's heart pounded as she read. These were not stories, they were records, a confessional stitched together with fear. Her grandmother hadn't summoned one spirit, she had summoned many, trying again and again to bring back the children she had lost. Miscarriages, stillbirths, one after another, and every time a new ritual, a new variation, a new desperation. And then, one day, something answered. Something that never left. The cradle refused to rot. I left it outside for a week. It stayed dry. I tried to burn it. The fire hissed and went out. Lan ran her hands over the bamboo cradle, still intact, still wrapped with red string, though now some sections were darker, as if scorched but healed. It was not just an object anymore. It was a vessel, a survivor. In the back of the diary, behind a sealed page stitched shut with black thread, Lan found the final entry. She carefully cut the threads with a ritual knife once used to prepare offerings. Inside was a single page, written in what appeared to be powdered bone mixed with red ink. The words were deliberate, terrified. To silence it, I gave it my name. To trap it, I gave it my womb. It did not want my love, it wanted my door. And now that I am old, it sleeps, but I feel it wake when she comes near, my granddaughter. Forgive me, Lan. The air around her went still. Not quiet, still, as if the very molecules of the room had paused to listen. Lan stood up slowly. Her name, her womb, her grief. They were never random. She was the next in line, not just by blood, but by design. The spirit had waited, and now she had arrived. She had opened the cradle. She had whispered. She had fed it. That night, the lullaby didn't come from the walls. It came from inside her. Lan lay curled in bed, sweating, eyes wide open in the dark. She felt something shift under her ribs, a fluttering like wings against glass, like something turning over gently in water. Her belly pulsed, not painful, but undeniable, a movement, a presence. She ran to the mirror, pulled the cloth away. Her reflection was already there, waiting. It smiled at her, lips parted, eyes gleaming. And then it opened its mouth and whispered, "Grandma said yes. Will you?" Lan collapsed. She lay there trembling on the floor for hours. The candle burned out, the house breathing quietly around her. She remembered being 5 years old in this house, sitting on her grandmother's lap, hearing lullabies with no words, being told never to enter the prayer room after dark, being warned never to touch the mirror. She had forgotten, or maybe she had repressed, because the memory returned now, sharp and cold. One night she had crept into the room. She had looked into the mirror, and something inside had smiled back. Not her, not then, but maybe the first time it saw her. In the morning, Lan packed incense, salt, and her grandmother's knife. She walked to the old shrine by the banyan tree, where roots coiled like serpents around cracked stone. The spirit inside the cradle wasn't just a ghost, it was a ritual gone wrong. A soul not born, not dead, but fed. Fed with grief, fed with longing, fed with names. She knelt at the shrine and began to chant, not to invite, not to plead, but to resist.
to name herself, to break the line. As she chanted, the ground around the banyan shivered. A breeze rose, hot and bitter, like breath exhaled through decayed lungs. Lon kept going. One page from the diary burned in her hand. The words twisted, turned, and finally ignited, bursting into a bright, unnatural flame that hissed like a baby's scream. And then silence, so vast it crushed her ears. And then the voice, not hers, not the child's, not her grandmother's, but something ancient, and it whispered one word: mine. Lon woke hours later in the shrine, covered in ash. Inside her pocket, the diary page had burned to dust, but the cradle back home was empty. No teeth, no milk stains, no whisper. It rocked, softly, alone, waiting.
The silence didn't last. For one day, the cradle stopped whispering. For one night, the mirror stayed still. For one breathless morning, Lon believed she had broken the cycle. But the curse had not vanished. It had simply moved inward. It began with her skin. Tiny welts formed along her collarbone, symmetrical like beads on a red string. They didn't itch, they didn't hurt, but they pulsed faintly, like something was beneath them. Lon touched them in the mirror. Her fingers trembled. She had seen these before, on her grandmother. Years ago, on the day of the funeral, when Lon had knelt beside the body and kissed her farewell, she remembered her fingers brushing across the old woman's neck and feeling the bumps there, hidden beneath her Aussie collar. At the time, she thought nothing of it. Now she knew. The marks were not scars. They were seals, binding points, like stitches in an invisible wound. The second sign came in the kitchen. She opened the rice bin to find the grains clumped together, wet, yellowed, and reeking of spoiled milk. Buried inside was something small and cold. Lon reached in and pulled out a pacifier. Old, rubber cracked, still slick. Not hers, not her child's. She dropped it instantly, bile rising in her throat. She hadn't owned a pacifier. She hadn't even reached that stage. This wasn't hers. It was someone else's offering, regurgitated from beneath the house like a swallowed memory. She returned to the altar, kneeling before the cradle with shaking hands. This time she didn't speak. She simply lit the incense and waited. The cradle did not move, but as the smoke curled upward, she heard a faint slurping sound, like a child feeding at the breast. The noise came from behind her. Lon turned. No one, but the mirror was uncovered. Her reflection held something in its arms, a shadowy bundle wrapped in cloth, rocking gently. Lon was not holding anything, but the reflection was, and it was smiling. She stumbled away from the altar and ran to the bath. The old ceramic tub had not been used in years, but she needed water, real water, grounding water. She stripped and stepped in, trying to scrub herself raw. That's when she found the third sign. Floating in the water, pale flakes. Not skin, not dirt, ash. She cupped it in her palm and stared. It wasn't from incense. It was lighter, almost flaky, as if burned from within something soft. She didn't know how it had gotten there. She only knew what it smelled like: lotus and breast milk. That night she bled again. Not heavily,
But the blood was mixed with something milky, something wrong. It was not her cycle. It was not natural. It was not human. Lon curled on the floor beside the altar, clutching her stomach. She whispered the prayer backward, then forward, then backward again. Nothing changed, except the cradle. It began to breathe. Slow, shallow rises, as if the bamboo itself had lungs. Lon stared in horror, and then it sighed, a contented, wet, infant sigh. And she felt her own womb respond, tightening, pulling, welcoming. She stayed awake until dawn, and when light finally touched the altar, she saw them. Footprints. Not on the floor this time. On her chest. 2 tiny, perfect, sooty impressions over her heart, like a baby had knelt there while she slept. She called the monk again, met him at the river's edge where the fish still never came. He didn't speak at first, just listened. Then finally he said, "It's no longer at the altar." Lon nodded, trembling. "It's in me." He said, "Yes, because you let it feed." "I didn't mean to." He said, "No one does." "What is it?" she asked, "if not my child?" The monk turned toward her, his blind eye glowing in the sun. "It's grief, starved for form, given a shape. Now it wants to be born." He told her the only way to sever the tie was to finish what her grandmother could not, a ritual of rejection, a declaration not of love, but refusal. But it would cost something, something sacred, something maternal. She would have to give the spirit what it could never mimic, true, conscious denial. That evening she prepared the ritual. She laid the cradle in the center of the house, surrounded it with salt, drew a circle in ash and blood, and lit 3 candles from 3 generations, one for her grandmother, one for her mother, and one for herself. Then she placed a strip of cloth soaked in her own milk, collected years ago during a hopeful cycle of IVF, frozen, saved, now thawed and trembling in her hand. She laid it inside the cradle and whispered, "Not yours, never was. I call you back to absence." The house shook. The cradle screamed, not a child's scream, a mother's, a howl of rage and rejection. The milk boiled in the cloth. The ash burst upward like smoke. The candles went out. And then the mirror shattered, not with sound, but with finality. Lon collapsed. When she woke, the cradle was empty, truly. No teeth, no stains, no voice. And for the first time in weeks, her womb was quiet, still. But as she stood, one final sign remained. On the altar, where her family incense once stood, was a bundle of gray-white crumbs, tiny, soft, flaky, like afterbirth made of ash. And on top of it, a note written in her grandmother's hand. "It only leaves if it believes you don't want it. Don't ever change your mind." Lan stayed awake for 2 days after the ritual. She didn't light incense, she didn't chant, she didn't go near the cradle. She told herself it was over, that the ash offering had worked, that the thing had left her body, had been denied, rejected, cast out. But something else had changed. The house. It was no longer haunted in the way it had been before. It was watching. She noticed it in small ways at first. The floorboards creaked even when she stood still. The old ceiling fan turned on by itself, even though the house had no electricity for 3 days. And then the reflections began to linger. She would pass by a mirror or a window and feel her image pause a heartbeat too long before copying her motion. She stopped covering the mirrors. They wanted to be seen now. The smell of lotus ash returned, not sweet, but spoiled, as if soaked in stagnant water, mixed with the copper scent of blood. It leaked from the walls, from the pillow, from the cradle, even from the pages of her grandmother's diary, which now began to rewrite itself. Lan flipped to a page she had read before, an old prayer for fertility. But now the ink had changed. New words had formed in the margins. Memory is a womb. You were not the first. The house was never empty. She dropped the book. The floor beneath her pulsed. That night, she tried to leave. She packed a small bag, unlocked the front gate, and stepped onto the muddy path leading out of Bến Troi. But the road never ended. She walked for 30 minutes, then an hour, then nearly 2. The mist grew thicker. The trees became unfamiliar. Birds stopped chirping. And then she saw it. The same house, her house, in front of her, as if she had never left, or worse, as if the house had followed. She screamed, threw the bag down, ran. Mud caked her ankles, branches tore her sleeves, but the village had vanished. There were no houses now, only mangrove roots and red string, tied between trees like an endless web. She fell to her knees and cried. That's when she heard it again, the lullaby, not from the cradle, but from beneath her feet. She returned just before dawn, covered in scratches, eyes wild. The house welcomed her. Lights flickered on. A bowl of rice steamed on the kitchen table, untouched, uneaten, yet warm. No one had cooked it, but the spoon was there, set in front of her seat, like memory trying to convince her it was love. In the prayer room, the cradle sat still, but beside it lay something new, a folded photograph. Lan opened it with trembling hands. It was black and white, faded, a woman holding a baby, smiling down, though her eyes were blurred. She recognized her great-grandmother, but not the child. It had no face, just a smudge where the eyes should be. Behind them, in the background, the same cradle, the same altar, the same house. Lan realized then, this wasn't her haunting. It wasn't even her grandmother's. It had always belonged to the house. Every woman born here had passed through the same grief, the same rituals, the same loss, the same desperate calling back. And every time, the house remembered. It held the grief like a jar holds water. It preserved it, fed on it, and when enough time passed, it awakened. She ran to the corner of the house where the walls met at a strange angle, a space her grandmother once called forbidden. She tore down the wooden panel. Behind it, darkness. She shone her phone's light inside. There, stacked neatly like family heirlooms, were 7 bamboo cradles, each bound with faded red string. Each cradle held something, a cloth bundle, a rattle, a pacifier, a curl of hair, a tiny sandal, a baby tooth, and one, the smallest, held a photograph of her, newborn, wrapped in blue cloth. But she had no memory of this picture ever being taken, and the background was not a hospital.
It was this house, this room, this cradle. Lan screamed, a long, ragged sound. The house pulsed in response. The floor groaned, the windows shut, the air grew thick, and in the walls the lullaby resumed. But this time it wasn't a melody. It was breathing, slow, deep, rhythmic, as if the entire house had lungs and it was exhaling her name. She collapsed beside the altar, trembling. She finally understood. She was not cursed. She was remembered, and the house did not want her to leave. It wanted her to stay, to continue, to carry. The final horror was not death. It was inheritance.
Lan found the monk again on the 9th day. He was waiting for her this time, not at the river, but on the steps of her grandmother's house, eyes closed, hands folded in prayer, head tilted toward the wind, as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. She hadn't invited him. He had come on his own, because the house was ready, and he could feel it too. "I thought I cast it out," Lan whispered, her voice raw. The monk didn't open his eyes. "You cast part of it out, the child form, the whisper." He reached into his robes and pulled out a handful of red string, frayed and stained, but not the root. Lan swallowed hard. "Then what is the root?" The monk's voice was gentle, but it struck like thunder. "Your grief." They sat in silence for a long time. Lan watched the wind stir the dead banana leaves, listened to the distant knock of bamboo chimes that hadn't moved in years. "Tell me," she said finally. "All of it." The monk opened his eyes. 120 years ago, a midwife in Bến Troi lost her first child, stillborn. They buried the body behind this house under a blooming lotus, but she wasn't ready to let go. So she wove a cradle from ghost bamboo, the kind that grows crooked where funerals have cast. She sang into it for 7 nights, burned milk, offered ash, and whispered the child's name under the red moon. Lan's breath caught. She was the first. The monk nodded. She called back something, maybe not her child, maybe not even human, but she believed, and belief is a door. Over time, other women came to her, grieving mothers, empty arms, silent nurseries, names never spoken aloud. The midwife taught them the ritual, the cradle, the ash, the string, and for many, the spirit answered. Something always answered. It wasn't evil at first, just hungry. Grief, when nurtured, becomes an altar, and when performed again and again, it becomes a religion. Lan whispered. The monk nodded. Now the house remembers the names better than the people do, and the cradle is no longer an invitation. He leaned closer. It's a womb. Lan felt her heart stumble in her chest. And me? Was I chosen? The monk shook his head. No one is chosen. He looked at her with something like sorrow. You offered. They sat in silence again. Then he placed something in her palm, a single blackened lotus seed. Swallow it, he said. If it blooms inside you, the cradle cannot take root. Lan hesitated. And if it doesn't? The monk looked away. Then it will grow through you. That night she prepared the ritual, not a summoning, a severing. She swallowed the seed, bitter, metallic, thick on her tongue. Then she sat beside the cradle and opened her grandmother's final journal page, the one written in blood and regret. She burned her hospital paperwork, scattered the ash in the cradle. She unwrapped her own hair from a comb, something the spirit had likely used to mimic her. She lit the last candle in the house, one her grandmother had sealed in a jar marked for ending. Then she said the words, not a prayer, a statement. I am not your mother. I do not claim you. I do not carry you. I bury you in the memory that birthed you. The air collapsed. The house groaned. From inside the cradle came a single sharp cry, not of pain, not of sorrow, of rage. Lan stood her ground. The mirror behind her shattered without sound. The red strings snapped. The candles died. The cradle burst open like a chest cracked too wide. And from within it, a scream rose, but not from a child, from hundreds. Women, mothers, generations of mourning, layered and fed and kept warm by memory, all calling, all demanding, all refusing to forget. Lan dropped to her knees, weeping, because she recognized the scream. It was hers too. When the light returned, the cradle was gone. Only the scorch mark remained, in the shape of a womb. In the center, the lotus seed lay cracked, empty. No bloom, no root, only silence. For the first time since she arrived, Lan slept through the night. No lullaby, no dreams, just a void. And in the morning, when she stood at the altar, her reflection looked back in real time, not smiling, not mocking, just tired, like her. She was not healed, but she was no longer held. Lan woke with blood beneath her fingernails, not dry, fresh, still warm. She hadn't cut herself. There were no wounds on her skin, and yet her hands trembled with the aftertaste of something done. She ran to the sink and scrubbed. The water turned pink, then red, then clear. Her reflection in the window above the basin shimmered in the early light. It didn't move when she did. It simply stared, tired, hollow-eyed. And then it blinked, but her eyes were still open. She hadn't dreamt. That's what terrified her most. She had no memory of sleep, no memory of standing, no memory of moving. But the cradle was gone, burned in ritual fire, reduced to ash and scorch marks. And yet her hands remembered something, a weight, a pulse, a shape. By mid-morning, the cramps returned. At first, she thought it was stress. Then she felt the pull, low, behind her navel, deep in her core. Not pain, not quite. It was the sensation of something pressing outward, like a seed swelling beneath soil after a sudden rain. She stumbled to the bathroom, checked her belly. No swelling, no marks, but her skin looked flushed, glowing from beneath, as if lit by something alive inside. She whispered a denial. The walls didn't answer, but her stomach twitched. She contacted the monk. She didn't tell him everything. She only asked, "If the cradle is destroyed, can it still come back?" His voice on the phone was a brittle whisper. "If the spirit has fed enough,
It no longer needs the cradle. Lan closed her eyes. What does it need? A long silence. Then, only you. That evening, the mirror cracked again. Not shattered, just a thin fracture, like a line drawn by a fingernail, straight through her reflection's belly. She covered it with cloth, but the image burned in her mind. Her hands on her stomach, smiling, rocking back and forth, as if holding something that wasn't there, or wasn't yet. She tried to eat. Everything tasted of salt. The rice boiled dry, the fruit spoiled on the table. She drank water and threw it up, but what came out wasn't clear. It was white, milky, and thick. In desperation, she returned to the sealed room behind the altar, the chamber where the other cradles had once been. She had cleared them out, burned them, but the space still pulsed. The red strings were growing back, vines of twisted thread crawling along the walls, weaving themselves from nothing. She stepped inside, and the air thickened. The lullaby had changed. It no longer sang, it breathed. She lit a candle and saw it. A shape on the far wall, painted in old blood and char. The symbol of a womb, inverted. Inside it, an eye, watching, always watching. Her grandmother had drawn it, or maybe someone before her. It was not a protective sigil. It was a contract. Lan fell to her knees, her hands pressing to her belly. She felt it then, a flutter, a kick. She screamed. No one heard. Only the walls, only the house, only it. The monk arrived before sunrise. She hadn't called him. He simply knew. He entered without speaking, stepped through the door she hadn't opened for anyone, and knelt beside her on the mat. He placed a hand on her stomach, closed his eyes, and wept. It's taken root. In me? She asked. He shook his head. In your memory. She didn't understand, so he explained. Not all spirits need blood to be born. Some feed on remembrance, on grief performed like prayer, on pain repeated like song, on rituals done in secret, again and again through generations. The cradle was never the true vessel. The women were, the house was, the name was, and now that Lan had fed it with love, then rage, then rejection, it had found fertile ground. What will it become? She asked. The monk did not answer. He only pressed her hand flat against her belly, and she felt it. Not a child, not a presence, not a soul, but a pulse, old, calm, satisfied, as if it had always been there and always would be. That night she bled again, more than before, but there was no pain, only a softness, a warmth, as if something inside her had nested. She tried to pray, but the words tangled in her throat. Every syllable sounded like a lullaby. She stood before the altar and stared at the space where the cradle once lay. There was nothing there now, just a slow rocking motion in the air. Invisible, but present. Her eyes filled with tears, and from inside her mind, not the house, not the mirror, she heard the voice, faint, childlike, almost loving. Mère, ơi, it's warm in here.
The red moon rose again, low, wide, pulsing with color like a fresh wound in the sky.
It had been exactly 1 lunar cycle since Lan first placed her offering in the cradle. But now, she carried the offering inside her. She felt it every time she breathed. Not a child, not a spirit, but a ritual. The villagers avoided her eyes. Aunt Ba crossed herself and turned away when Len passed. Doors shut quietly behind her. Shrines remained unlit. Incense stayed cold. The entire village seemed to know, not what she had done, but what she had become. The monk no longer visited. She hadn't seen him in days. And the house, once lively with whispering, had gone deathly still. But not in peace. It was the stillness of a mouth held shut in prayer or in fear. Lan stood at the mirror. Her reflection had returned to moving in time with her, but her face was different now. Fuller, warmed by something beneath the skin, something that glowed. She pressed her fingers to her stomach. It didn't move this time, but it watched. She could feel it. And when she turned off the lights, her belly glowed faintly, a red hue, like the moon. At midnight, the altar lit itself. No match, no hand, just 3 candles, the same color as old blood, flickering to life on their own. And between them, ash began to gather, from nowhere, swirling, dancing, forming a shape, not a figure, a symbol. The womb, inverted, again. Lan tried to step back, but her feet were rooted. Salt had been poured around her in a perfect circle. When? By whom? She didn't know. She only knew the house had claimed her again, not by haunting, by habit. From outside, the lullaby returned, not from the walls, not from the cradle, from the trees, as if the whole village were humming in unison. Lan stepped outside. The sky was bleeding red. The moon hung so low it brushed the tops of the banana leaves. The wind didn't move. The world held its breath. And then she saw them. Shadows. Women. Dozens of them. Standing between the trees. Heads bowed. Hands on bellies. Red string tied around their wrists. None of them moved, but Lan recognized their faces. Portraits from her grandmother's altar. Photographs long buried. Generations of women. All mothers, all mourners, all called. She turned to run, but the house was already behind her again, its windows glowing, the front door open, waiting, as if it had followed her outside, or worse, as if she had never left. Inside, the walls were wet, beating like muscle. The floorboards pulsed in time with her breath. And at the center of the room, the cradle was back, whole, rewoven. Its red string gleamed like wet sinew. Lan stepped closer, but it rocked before she touched it, gently, rhythmically, like it knew her again, like it remembered her hands. And inside, something moved beneath the cloth. She reached in, slowly, shaking, and pulled out a bundle, heavy, wet, warm. She unwrapped it, not a child, not a corpse, not a doll, a mirror, polished obsidian, and in it her reflection, pregnant, bleeding from the eyes, smiling. She screamed and dropped it. The obsidian cracked, the walls howled, the candles burst, the cradle fell silent. And then, from within her, a contraction, sharp, real. Her body arched, collapsed, twitched. She could feel it inside her now, clawing upward, not downward, climbing, not to be born, but to see. She crawled to the mirror, pulled herself up, blood in her mouth, her belly glowing. She opened her mouth to speak, to say her name, to take it back, to undo everything. But the mirror spoke first. Her own voice echoed back. You offered. She collapsed, and behind her, the cradle rocked faster, faster. The air filled with crying, hundreds all around, not from babies, from mothers, wailing, praying, regretting. The red moon struck the house like lightning, its glow seeping through the roof, the walls, the floors, soaking everything. She screamed one last time, and then silence. When the village woke the next morning, the house stood undisturbed. No smoke, no blood, no ashes. Just a woman sitting on the porch, cradling something, smiling. Lan, but different. Too still, too serene, too empty. No one approached, no one spoke. They had seen this before, and they would see it again, because the red moon always returns, and the cradle always remembers.
Lan woke in a room that wasn't hers. She was lying on a mat, the air thick with incense and humidity. The floor beneath her was old tile, patterned with red lotuses faded by time. Above her, a slow-turning ceiling fan carved the silence like a blade through fog. She sat up slowly. There were no walls, only curtains of red thread hanging from the ceiling, swaying gently, brushing her skin like fingers made of memory. She was no longer in the present. She was inside the past, inside a memory that did not belong to her. Voices echoed in the distance, soft, chanting, full of sorrow, women's voices. Then a lullaby, then silence, then crying. She stood, and the thread parted, revealing a woman kneeling beside a cradle. Her grandmother, younger, unlined. Her face was slack with exhaustion, her hands trembling as she laid something into the cradle, a bundle wrapped in old cloth, still wet with afterbirth. There was no baby inside, only a doll, stuffed with lotus petals and ash. The red string around the cradle tightened as her grandmother whispered a name, one that Land couldn't hear, one that didn't want to be heard. Land stepped closer. Her grandmother looked up, but not at her, through her. This was a memory, but it knew it was being watched. The cradle rocked once, then again, and then the doll twitched. The curtains changed, thread shifted, the scene dissolved. Now her grandmother was older, hunched, alone, standing in front of a mirror. Her reflection didn't match her movements. It smiled when she cried. It sang when she was silent. It spoke when she said nothing. You still want it, don't you? Just one child, just one chance. Her grandmother wept. Anything, she whispered. I'll give anything. The reflection stopped smiling. Then give your name. The curtains shifted again. A field now, night, a red moon overhead. Her grandmother knelt beneath the banyan tree, drawing symbols in ash and blood. She was not alone. 7 cradles surrounded her, some empty, some full of cloth, one moving. The wind howled with grief, and the spirit came, not with a body, not with form, but with sound. A gurgling laugh, a baby's cry layered with words, a whisper shaped like a scream.
Lan watched as her grandmother bent low and cut into her palm. She dripped blood into each cradle, then into her mouth, then into the dirt. And then she spoke the words Lan remembered from the diary. I give you my name. I give you my womb. I carry you no longer. And the spirit entered her. The scene split in two. On one side, her grandmother's life continued. She raised her daughter. She aged. She lived. On the other, the spirit slept, bound not by chains, but by identity, by the name, by the sacrifice, by a deal. It would not take her child. It would not haunt her womb, so long as the name was never spoken again, so long as the cradle remained hidden, so long as no one else offered. Lan watched as her grandmother, in her final years, wrote the prayer in her diary, hands trembling, eyes wet with fear. She's coming back, the granddaughter. She is strong, she will survive it. But I am sorry. I never told her how to say no. The curtains burned, red string flared, turned to smoke. Lan was pulled backward, dragged through decades of blood and silence and sorrow. She landed in the prayer room, now, present. The cradle was gone, the altar was cracked, and her hands were wet with blood, her own blood. On the floor lay a mirror. In its cracked surface, her grandmother's face, but aged, decomposing, whispering, "You must say it." Lan knelt beside the mirror. "Say what?" The reflection blinked slowly, then mouthed a word, a name. Lan's true name, the one she had never spoken out loud, the one her mother had buried to break the lineage. The name passed through the women of this house, the name the spirit still held. To say it was to end the contract. To take back the name was to take back the womb. But to take back the womb meant bearing the grief in full. No more rituals, no more offerings, no more pretending the pain could be undone. Just silence, just loss, just death. Lan opened her mouth and spoke the name. Her grandmother's, her mother's, hers, all at once. Tin Ying! The house screamed. A wind tore through the walls. The altar split. The thread fell from the ceiling like rain, and every cradle that had ever rocked in that house burned away in a silence so total it sounded like the world starting over. When the dust settled, Lan sat alone. Her hands were empty, her womb quiet, her name hers again. And for the first time, the house breathed out, not in menace, in relief. Her grandmother's voice echoed one last time, not from the mirror, not from the walls, but from within her. Thank you. Now, let it end. The house was still, but not empty. Lan could feel it, beneath the floorboards, inside the walls, under her skin. Something was coiling, not waiting, gestating. She hadn't slept in 2 days. Her body rejected food, rejected light, rejected rest. She bled in cycles no longer tied to the moon. Her belly, though flat, ached with the weight of remembered pregnancy. And every mirror now showed her at different stages, first trimester, then third, then postpartum, then nothing at all. The house was a maze of versions, 1,000 possible mothers, none of them real, none of them whole. At sunrise, she opened the last door in the house, a storage room her grandmother had sealed decades ago with wax, symbols, and a single nail driven through a jade coin. The wax had melted, the nail had rusted, the door opened on its own. Inside was a cot, a low bed of rotted cloth surrounded by decayed offerings, dried plums, a broken doll, a milk bottle filled with black water. And in the center, a new cradle. Not bamboo, not woven. Flesh. It pulsed like a heartbeat, wet, translucent, breathing. Lon stepped closer, and something moved inside it. She fell to her knees weeping because she recognized it, not as a child, not as a ghost, but as the sum of every offering made before her, every sorrow, every name whispered in desperation, every woman who had rocked the cradle and begged the void for mercy. This was the result. A child born of ritual, of repetition, of refusal to grieve. It opened its eyes. They were black, mouthless. And yet it spoke, not in words, in hunger, in need. Lon backed away. "No," she said, "no more." It sat up. The flesh of the cradle stretched and tore, but there was no blood, only steam. The child thing crawled toward her on stunted limbs, dragging a red string behind it, like an umbilical cord made of memory. From its chest hung an amulet, her name, spelled in bone. She ran, but the house was closed, windows nailed shut, doors sealed. The floor shifted beneath her feet, not creaking, but breathing. Everywhere she turned, the same voice echoed through the walls. Me oi, you called. She returned to the altar, or what was left of it. Now it was a mirror, tall, cracked, but whole enough to reflect the truth. She stepped in front of it and saw herself, holding the child, rocking it, singing. But in the mirror, she had no eyes, only hollows, only dark, only grief. Behind her, the thing climbed into her arms, real, heavy, wet. It curled against her chest like it had always belonged there. And for a moment, a single moment, Lon believed. She felt love, not warmth, not joy, but the terrifying comfort of being filled after so long feeling empty. It cooed, nuzzled her, and whispered, "Now be still." She closed her eyes, and the dream came. In it, she was in the village, but everyone was her. Every woman, every child, every old monk, all versions of herself, humming lullabies into open cradles, feeding spirits that wore her face, cradling babies with no eyes, no mouth, no form, just need. And every time she handed one over, another appeared, crying, reaching, repeating. She woke on the floor, the house dark, the cradle
gone. But her arms still held something. Her hands shaped in the pose of a mother rocking a child, empty, but unwilling to release. She couldn't remember how long she'd been there. Hours, days, years. The spirit had not possessed her, it had rebirthed itself through her. She stood, and her reflection rose with her. But now, they matched. Exactly. No delay. No mockery. Because now they were one. The mirror split down the middle with a sharp crack. She reached into it and pulled out the final piece, a knife. Small, ceremonial, the same her grandmother once used. She held it to her womb, not to cut, to claim, and whispered the words that were never meant for birth, but for ending. I carry no child. I carry no curse. You die with me. The knife sunk in, but there was no blood. Only smoke. Only strings unraveling. Only the cradle screaming without sound. She fell, and when she woke, the room was ash, not burned, evaporated. Nothing remained. No thread, no mirror, no altar, no house. Only the banyan tree and the moon, white, quiet, full. Lan stood beneath its light, hand on her belly. It did not move. She did not hum. There was no lullaby left. Only silence and the soft whisper of wind that did not call her May.
Years passed. The village of Bến Troi remained quiet. Fog still settled over the river in the early mornings. Lotus flowers still bloomed out of season near the old banyan tree, and the house, the one at the farthest edge of the village, stood untouched, as if time had forgotten it or feared it. No one had lived there since. No one dared to speak Lan's name aloud. The villagers told their children never to go near the gate. They said the house was sick, that it remembered, that it watched the women of the village grow up and waited to see which ones would grieve, which ones would offer. They never found a body, not Lan's, not her grandmother's. Only a single object remained in the ashes. A polished stone mirror, unbroken, face down in the prayer room. No reflection, no frame, just silence. And so the house remained, a hollow place filled with memory, the cradle long gone, or so they thought. One day, a woman arrived from the city. She was young, alone, pale, carrying only a suitcase and a small urn. She walked the old road at dusk, following the scent of incense and the cry of the frogs. No one recognized her, but some of the elders narrowed their eyes. They saw her hands, thin wrists, loose sleeves, a ring missing from her finger, eyes rimmed red, the look of someone who had buried a child or a future, or both. She didn't ask anyone for directions. She walked straight to the house, opened the gate without hesitation. The lock had rusted away. The door opened at her touch.
as if it had been waiting for her. Inside, the air was dry. No mold, no dust, just stillness, like a breath held beneath water. She wandered through the rooms, touched the walls, stepped around the scorch mark near the altar as if guided by instinct. And in the corner, she found it. Not a full cradle, just the base, a curve of old bamboo half swallowed by the floorboards. She knelt beside it, and the house sighed. That night, she lit a candle, opened the urn, poured a pinch of ash onto a folded cloth, then placed it gently into the curve of the cradle's remains. No prayers, no names, just grief, raw and wordless. The moon rose red, but no one noticed. Only the woman, only the house, only what waited beneath the floorboards. The cradle began to hum again, a single note, not a song, a signal. The thread had returned, unseen, unspoken, but binding. In the village, the lights flickered. An old woman woke screaming and couldn't remember why. A baby was born without a shadow, a mirror cracked in a sealed temple, and the monk, long thought dead, opened his eyes in the river's mist and wept. The woman stayed in the house. No one saw her again, but sometimes when the fog rolls in just right and the moon burns the color of old blood, those who pass near the gate swear they hear something, a soft sound, familiar, rhythmic, wooden, the creak of a cradle. And sometimes a lullaby, not sung, not hummed, just breathed, like the house itself was remembering. Because the spirit never needed a name, never needed a body, never needed blood. Only sorrow, only ritual, only a woman with empty arms and the desire to fill them. And when she comes, the cradle will rock again and again and again. Because in Bến Troi, grief is inherited, and the cradle never forgets.